Good day, children. Today we'll be dealing with the second chapter in Snapshots, The Address by Marga Minko, who is a Dutch journalist and writer born in 1920. We are all aware of the Holocaust, persecution of Jews, and the political consequences before and during the Second World War as a result of Hitler's belief of racial supremacy. But at a personal level, what could have been their loss is what we see in this chapter. The Address by Marga Minko narrates the story of a Jewish lady, possibly the narrator herself, who, after losing her entire family in the Holocaust, returns to the address to collect her family's possessions that her mother, who is called Mrs. S in the story, had left with Mrs. Darling, a non-Jewish lady, before she had to leave her homeland. The story keeps shuttling between the present and the past. The Address by Marga Minko. "Do you still know me?" I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. She had opened the door a chink. I came closer and stood on the step. "No, I don't know you. I'm Mrs. S.'s daughter." She held a hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. She kept staring at me in silence. Perhaps I was mistaken, I thought. Perhaps it isn't her. I had seen her only once fleetingly, and that was years ago. It was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. The woman let go of the door and stepped to the side. She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. She saw that I was looking at the cardigan and half hid herself again behind the door. But I knew now that I was right. The narrator, a young girl, knocked on a door, and as the lady opened it, she introduced herself as Mrs. S.'s daughter. The lady showed no sign of recognition. On the contrary, she held the door in a way to make clear that the narrator was not welcome. For some time, she kept staring quietly at the narrator. So much so that the narrator felt that the woman was not the person she had been looking for. The narrator recalled having seen her briefly once years ago. But the woman soon stepped away from the door and moved aside. The narrator noticed her wearing her narrator's mother's green knitted cardigan. The lady saw her looking at the cardigan and hid herself partially behind the door. And then the narrator realized that she had come to the right address. "Well, you knew my mother," I asked. "Have you come back?" said the woman. "I thought that no one had come back." "Only me." A door opened and closed in the passage behind her. A musty smell emerged. "I regret I cannot do anything for you." "I have come here specially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment." "It's not convenient for me now," said the woman. "I can't see you. Another time." She nodded and cautiously closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. So when the narrator asked this lady about her mother, she said that she had thought that none of the people who had left had come back, which signifies that the Jewish people who had fled the country, leaving their possessions behind, fearing persecution, had never come back. The narrator says, only she came. The lady regretted her inability to do anything for her, but the narrator insisted on talking to her as she had especially come all the way to meet her. However, the lady refused to talk to her, and the narrator had no option but to leave. I stood where I was on the step. The curtain in front of the bay window moved. Someone stared at me and would then have asked what I wanted. Oh, nothing, the woman would have said. It was nothing. I looked at the nameplate again. Darling, it said, in black letters on white enamel. And on the jamb, a bit higher, the number 46. So as she was standing on the step, she saw a curtain move aside and was sure someone inside had inquired, and the lady would have said it was nothing. The narrator stood on the doorstep, looked at the nameplate again. It read, Darling, and a little higher she saw the number 46. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother who had given me the address years ago. It had been in the first half of the war. I was home for a few days, and it struck me immediately that something or other about the rooms had changed. I missed various things. My mother was surprised. I should have noticed so quickly. Then she told me about Mrs. Darling. I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. Every time she leaves here, she takes something home with her, said my mother. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there. She had trouble lugging those large vases, and I'm afraid she got a crick in her back from the crockery. My mother shook her head pityingly. I would never have dared ask her. She suggested it to me herself. She even insisted. She wanted to save all my nice things. If we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says. So the narrator walked back to the station, thinking about her mother who had given her this address years ago when during the first half of the war she had gone home for a few days. She had then at once realized that various things were missing from her home. Her mother had then told her about Mrs. Darling, an old contact of hers. She had been visiting their place regularly, and every time she went back, she took something home with her. These things included table silver, antique plates, large vases, and the crockery. She used to tell the narrator's mother that she wanted to save all her nice things in case they had to leave. Have you agreed with her that she should keep everything? I asked. As if that's necessary, my mother cried. It would simply be an insult to talk like that. And think about the risk she's running each time she goes out of her door with a full suitcase or bag. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She looked at me reprovingly, and after that, we spoke no more about it. So the narrator inquired with her mother whether there was a verbal agreement about keeping all the things. The mother felt that would be insulting and reminded the narrator of the risk Mrs. Darling had to take for this family. The mother seemed to have nothing against her. However, the narrator was not convinced, and she noticed her mother's disapproving look, and after that they did not discuss this issue again. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to things on the way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war, but I did not want to go further than was necessary. I didn't want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me again, as I had the first time I met her. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. I had got up late, and coming downstairs, I saw my mother about to see someone out, a woman with a broad back. There is my daughter, said my mother. She beckoned to me. The woman nodded and picked up the suitcase under the coat rack. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. Does she live far away? I asked, seeing the difficulty she had going out of the house with the heavy case. In Marconi Street, said my mother. Number 46, remember that. The narrator was now walking through familiar places for the first time since the war, and now she reached the station. The sights evoked memories from a precious time. She did not want to go around much as it evoked more painful memories. Now she recalled her first meeting with Mrs. Darling. It was just the day after her mother had talked about her. Her mother introduced her to Mrs. Darling. She had noticed the woman walk out with heavy case. Her mother informed her that she lived in Marconi Street, number 46. And Mrs. S., her mother, had asked the narrator to remember this address for the future. I had remembered it, but I had waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the liberation, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff, and naturally, I was also rather afraid of it. Afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to a connection that no longer existed, which were hidden away in cupboards and boxes and waiting in vain until they were put back in their place again, which had endured all those years because they were things. But gradually everything became more normal again. Bread was getting to be a lighter color. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened. A room with a view you were more used to glancing at each day. And one day I noticed. I was curious about all the positions that must still be at that address. I wanted to see them, touch, and remember. The narrator had safely stored that address in a memory and had allowed several years to pass. After the war ended, she had lost interest in those positions and was also afraid of coming face to face with things with which she had lost connection. Those things she believed were safely kept hidden away in boxes and cupboards and tolerated such confinement because they were only things and not humans. How things returned back to normal state after the war is being described by the narrator in an unusual and touching manner. Bread baked was of a better quality. She could sleep on her bed unthreatened. She could have a room that showed the same view every day. So all these signifies the fear that they had earlier of Nazis coming in the night to arrest the Jews and take them to the concentration camps, and how they kept shifting from place to place fearing persecution. Now, several years after the war, one day she became curious about her mother's position. She felt an intense urge to see, touch, and remember her mother's belongings. After my first visit in vain to Mrs. Darling's house, I decided to try a second time. Now a girl of about 15 opened the door to me. I asked her if her mother was at home. No, she said. My mother's doing an errand. No matter, I said. I'll wait for her. I followed the girl along the passage. An old-fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror. We never used it because it was much more cumbersome than a single candlestick. So after her first futile visit to Mrs. Darling's house, she decided to try a second time. So this time, when she went there, a girl of about 15 opened the door and let her in. Her mother was not at home as she was out doing some errand. The narrator followed the girl along the passage. She noticed an old-fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder that the narrator's family had never used, as it was much more bulky than a single candlestick. Won't you sit down? Asked the girl. She held open the door of the living room and I went inside past her. I stopped horrified. I was in a room I knew and did not know. I found myself in the midst of things I did want to see again, but which oppressed me in the strange atmosphere, or because of the tasteless way everything was arranged, because of the ugly furniture, or the muggy smell that hung there. I don't know. But I scarcely dared to look around me. The girl moved a chair. I sat down and stared at the woolen tablecloth. I rubbed it. My fingers grew warm from rubbing. I followed the lines of the pattern. Somewhere on the edge, there should be a burn mark that had never been repaired. The girl now led the narrator to the living room. She was more polite than her mother. The narrator was dismayed, seeing all the things, seeing all the possession in the room. The room had things that she had wanted to see again, but which now seemed to have a strange, stressful effect on her. She could not place what the exact reason was. It could be because of the inelegant way everything was arranged, or because of the ugly furniture, or the humid smell that hung in the room. She noticed the woolen tablecloth. She rubbed her fingers, which had been her childhood habit. She knew that when she rubbed her fingers, she would reach a burn mark that had never been repaired. My mother will be back soon, said the girl. I have already made tea for her. Will you have a cup? Thank you. I looked up. The girl put cups ready on the tea table. She had a broad bag just like her mother. She poured tea from a white pot. All it had was a gold border on the lid. I remembered. She opened a box and took some spoons out. Now the girl put cups on the tea table and poured tea from a white pot with a gold border on the lid. Then the girl opened a box and took some spoons out. The familiarity of all these things clouded the narrator's mind. These emotions were different than any other that she had ever known. That's a nice box, I heard my own voice. It was a strange voice, as though each sound was different in this room. Oh, you know about them? She had turned around and brought me my tea. She laughed. My mother says it's antique. We've got lots more. She pointed round the room. See for yourself. I had no need to follow her hand. I knew which things she meant. I just looked at the still life over the tea table. As a child, I had always fancied the apple on the pewter plate. We use it for everything, she said. Once we even ate off the plates hanging there on the wall. I wanted to so much, but it wasn't anything special. I had found the burn mark on the tablecloth. The girl looked questioningly at me. The narrator now complimented the young girl on the nice box. She laughed and said her mother had told her that it was an antique. She said that they had lots of antique in the house. She pointed around the room. The narrator noticed various things that brought back memories of the past. She remembered that as a child she had always liked the apple on the pewter plate. The young girl told the narrator that at one time they even ate in the plates hanging on the wall. The narrator by then, who had been rubbing her finger on the woolen cloth, found the burn mark. The girl looked curiously at the narrator. Yes, I said. You get so used to touching all these lovely things in the house, you hardly look at them anymore. You only notice when something is missing because it has to be repaired, or because you have lent it, for example. Again, I heard the unnatural sound of my voice and I went on. I remember my mother once asked me if I would help her polish the silver. It was a very long time ago and I was probably bored that day, or perhaps I had to stay at home because I was ill, as she had never asked me before. I asked her which silver she meant and she replied, surprised, that it was the spoons, forks and knives. Of course, and that was a strange thing. I didn't know the cutlery we ate of every day was silver. The narrator said that one gets so used to touching all such lovely things in the house that one only notices when something is missing because it has to be repaired or because one has lent it. She continued how her mother had once asked her to polish the silver, the spoons, forks, and knives. Before that, she had never realized that the cutlery they used for eating every day was made of silver. The girl laughed again. I bet you don't know it's either. I looked intently at her. What we eat with? She asked. Well, do you know? She hesitated. She walked to the sideboard and wanted to open a drawer. I'll look, it's in here. I jumped up. I was forgetting the time. I must catch my train. She had a hand on the drawer. Don't you want to wait for my mother? No, I must go. I walked to the door. The girl pulled the drawer open. I can find my own way. As I walked down the passage, I heard the jingling of spoons and forks. So the girl loved hearing the narrator's narration. She walked to the sideboard to open a drawer and show the narrator what they ate with. But by then, the narrator realized that it was time for her to catch a train. She says she can find her way out. She walks out and she hears the jingling of spoons and forks as the girl was examining them. At the corner of the road, I looked up at the nameplate. Marconi Street, it said. I had been at number 46. The address was correct, but now I didn't want to remember it anymore. I wouldn't go back there because the objects that are linked in your memory with the familiar life of former times instantly lose their value when severed from them. You see them again in strange surroundings. And what should I have done with them in a small rented room where the shreds of blackout paper still hung along the windows and no more than a handful of cutlery fitted in the narrow table drawer? I resolved to forget the address. Of all the things I had to forget, that would be the easiest. So, after seeing all her possessions in a strange surrounding, she just wanted to wipe out her past. The narrator realized that the objects that are associated in one's memory with the familiar life of earlier times at once lose their value when one is cut off from them. She had valued them as they were the possessions of her mother. But now that her mother was dead, the value of those things had faded. Moreover, she did not need them in a small rented room where she lived in poverty. All the wallpaper seemed to be hanging down, and not more than a handful of cutlery would fit in her narrow table drawer. So she decided to forget her past, as dwelling in the past only ends up adding to the emotional turmoil a person might be going through in his or her life. This inspiring short story teaches us the importance of letting things go. Both past and future are illusions, and all we have with us and what matters the most is the present. So let's live in the present and not carry the pain of the past. With that, explanation of the address ends. Thank you, children.